Thank you. It's also awkward when people introduce you and you're sitting in the audience, right? So the reason why I'm here today is actually because of this man over there.
Sorry.
So Ian and I were catching up over a coffee, and we're talking about this report that we did mainly with my sidekick, Rosie Collins, for Business New Zealand. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is essentially what I speak to business about in terms of their engagement with politics, rather than a political party. And I know you guys are a political party, but this is more of the conversation we have in boardrooms and in business gatherings. This is just to give you a sense of how I'm trying to sort of move along that community towards finding ways for us to talk about politics and policy in a way that's less partisan and more evidence-based. So there's a bunch of things this is the way that I pitch to business, because you have to treat them like infants usually. And I do sometimes crack jokes. It's okay if you laugh. But I usually start them off with a little bit of good news, that things are getting better. There's actually lots of good things that are happening, that the world is actually getting better, and show some of those big things. But also I try and explain to them that actually right now, in the rest of the world particularly, but also here, history is making a comeback. After a relatively long period of quite stable, relatively moderate kind of policies, we're probably going to be experiencing a lot more volatility and a lot more extremist stuff playing out than we have experienced before. And within that, New Zealand had lots of risks and opportunities. And the real story here is, how do we turn those risks into opportunities or leverage those opportunities that are there? Because for business in particular, where they benefit the most is when those wider policy settings are consistent and predictable, right? They don't really care what the rules are, as long as I know what those rules are, and those rules are consistent, and I can know how I'm going to set my business up. And so there is a real focus for businesses, particularly right now. If you look at what's going on with our politics and internationally, it's becoming more fractured, it's becoming more ideological. A lot of the first term, or the first year at least, of government is spent going Control Z, right? I'm going to undo the last lots things. Now that's fine from an ideological perspective, but it sucks as a business, right? Because what you're experiencing is those changes that are quite rapid, and it's really hard for your business because you've done all this work to deal with these policy changes that the last lot put in. All of a sudden it's been undone and you have to redo everything again. So there are some really big changes there for business in terms of how they think about things. So the words that I use with them a lot is around coordination and cohesion. And it's really around how can business put forward a voice that's more consistent, right? They're asking for something that's actually, there is some stuff that we want as New Zealand business. We don't care who's in power. We just want some stuff done that's good for New Zealand. And what we kind of termed that was that minimum viable bipartisanship. Now, it's a big mouthful, but whether it's bipartisanship or non-partisanship, it doesn't really matter. Really what we're trying to pitch is, are there some things that we could just agree are good for New Zealand, regardless of who's sitting in the beehive? And I think most New Zealanders would agree that there are many things like that. And the question is, how do we get there? And within this, there are lots of different actors who play very important roles in this. And with this conversation and the conversation I have with business, I'm always asking them to imagine what is your specific role in that. And you guys can play along with this conversation today, because as citizens, as voters, as party faithful, I think it's important for us to have those perspectives as well. So I'm quite a depressing kind of guy, because I see all the negatives out in the world, right? All the risks that are out there. And so I usually start off with this little picture of global change and how things have gotten better. On the left-hand side is a picture of rising life expectancy around the world, and on the right-hand side is falling extreme poverty around the world. So there are actually lots of things that are happening that are still good, and that's actually a really positive thing for us to celebrate. And we should not forget that even in New Zealand, even today, when we can see lots of bad things happening out there, there's also a lot of good things happening. So we need to just keep that in context, that New Zealand's still an amazing place to live. There are still a lot of positives to celebrate, and we should not get ourselves too bogged down in only seeing the negatives. We should also celebrate the positives that are there. But the reason why I think it's important for us to come together like we've never done before is because around the world we're seeing rising kind of tensions, rising polarization. And so the charts are not that important, but the story that I want to tell you is that what we're seeing is, after essentially that kind of period of post-war era when we were in this path of convergence, the rise of democracy, the rise of globalization, the rise of talking about things with very similar terms and ways of expressing hopes, fears, and dreams. I think we're now starting to see that break, right? Whether it's Brexit or it's Trump, but also just the rise of, I think, very authoritarian regimes, the rise of, I think, a lot of hatred out there in the political spheres. What we're seeing is this loss of faith in democracy as a model, but also what it's actually reflecting is this rise of polarization within and across countries. And this polarization is really important because it can either be true for New Zealand or it could be something that happens out there and affects us regardless. So whether it's about us as a people or whether it's us operating in a global sense, it matters. And it'll matter to us in a very kind of visceral sense, in the sense that New Zealand is a trading nation, a third of our economy is stuff going in and out, and we're very dependent on ships, right? And South China Sea is not guaranteed safe passage. It's not guaranteed that our trading partners will always get along. And when you look at kind of the rhythms of history, what we're experiencing over the course of the last 10, 15 years is this rise of much more of this kind of wars, hot wars that are spilling over borders. Until recently, it was very much within borders, right? It's like, yeah, there's a lot of infighting that's going on in Africa, but nobody in the rest of the world really cared, right? Unless you could go and exploit it to your advantage. But over the last 10 years, we've seen this escalation of hot wars, which I think means that we should be prepared for security and global politics becoming much more important. Now, why that matters is the way New Zealand has navigated its way over the course of the post-Second World War era is we're a neutral country when it comes to foreign policy. What that means is we'll take the defense from the West and we'll trade with the East. Well, we may not get that free pass forever. It's not really independent foreign policy, it's just convenient foreign policy. And so it's a really hard one for New Zealand because it's done us really well, right? We've kind of not really done the defense stuff, but we've benefited from the overall kind of the umbrella of security, and as well as the rising tide of globalization. The tariffs and those, I don't know, I'm thinking about Trump, right? I'm thinking about Trump and a lot of those other people who are bringing in a lot more of that protectionist approaches towards policy. So we haven't seen that really for a long time. This is all very new. And we've had a taste of this with Trump in the past. We saw that protectionism, the tariffs that he imposed last time he was in power. But what's really interesting was, while it affected certain countries and certain bits of trade, overall, the trends of globalization didn't really stop. They kind of went sideways. So yes, there was volatility and there was a lot of news and a lot of noise. But in reality, if you look at the actual numbers around movement of people, movement of goods, movement of capital, movement of information, those things didn't actually slow down. So globalization remains a force. It's not increasing, but it hasn't fallen. So again, we should be just a little bit mindful that the things that are happening out there are risks, but not necessarily things that have bitten yet. Of course, climate change is coming at us in a pretty big way. I hear the weather in Wellington is good again. Climate change is the only good thing that's the only good thing to come out of climate change. But with rising climate change, we are going to see quite significant shifts in terms of geopolitics, right? Not only are we going to see it in terms of the biological and physical changes, but also in terms of geopolitical changes. I don't know if you can see the picture on the right-hand side. That shows you a picture of global trade as a share of global GDP. And essentially, after the Second World War, it was this massive upward tide, right? And there was essentially Asia and the poor world just coming up in a big way, just getting connected into the global economy like they had never done before. And we, as New Zealand, benefited massively from that, right? All the growth that we've had in our exports has been very much about that massive growth that we had in globalization. But this stuff is changing quite rapidly, right? We know that growth can't go on forever because we've got actors like Trump who are in power now who are not going to allow things to go on as they are. So what is New Zealand's role in this, and what are the kind of big themes that we should be thinking about? And so the big themes that I really try to frighten my business audience with is, you need to really understand geopolitics. You can't just go, it happens out there and New Zealand is sorted, because I don't think we can do that. Because I think we should assume there will be more conflict. We can assume that there'll be more fiscal pressures, there'll be more austerity, there'll be more stop-start taking place. We should expect a rise in protectionism, but most importantly, we should expect less cooperation. And less cooperation is really hard for New Zealand because if you think about New Zealand, we're a margin of error in everything, right? But we get a really unusual weight when it comes to global negotiations, whether it's free trade agreements or security stuff or at the UN. New Zealand has a voice. In no other setting, if we didn't have the coordination, in no other setting would New Zealand matter, right? Having that wider context of global cooperation is actually super useful and valuable for New Zealand because it gives us a voice that's powerful and influential. I think we're about to lose that because the geopolitical landscape is changing. What's also happening around the world, I think, is a change in politics. Politics is very focused on finding the center, right? The median voter. But let me put it to you that my working hypothesis is there is no median voter. There's a bunch of fractured groups and their interests are so fractured it's really hard to find one common group that's the dominant source of votes. And if you don't have a dominant source of votes, you have to find ways of working together. And that's a really hard one. And that means whenever we see governments in power for short periods of time, they're going to pursue unorthodox policy. They're going to just give shit a go, right? Because they can. They're like, I might get voted out in 3 years' time, I better do it now. But that's not necessarily good ways of making policy, nor are they necessarily good things for the country. So unorthodox policy becomes much more likely, but they become less durable. Remember the Control Z, that undo? Everybody's going to press undo. This is essentially that was happening at a Labour Party conference in the weekend, who said, we're going to undo the things that this lot did, just like what this lot did when they came into power, right? And so, fine, but it means that for the rest of us who have to navigate this wider landscape, we're dealing with political uncertainty in a much bigger way than we have before. And I can't spell, but I think essentially we're going to have our institutions under attack. Right? And we've seen this already, and this is not new, right? This is not new. This happened under Cullen. Cullen hated the Treasury, right? He attacked the Treasury endlessly while he was the finance minister. But so have many other ministers, so have many other governments. And their slow erosion of capability and confidence in a public service shows. They rise up to the occasion when there is a crisis, right? Earthquake, pandemic, man, those guys are superstars. They just rose to the occasion and they just went ahead and did it. Can I have some good policy? No, sorry. So there are some real challenges there. When I look at what's going on with the global change in terms of politics, geopolitics, I think when it comes to the transition in terms of climate policies, I think we're going to find it really hard. Particularly on fuel transition, which in my mind is one of the big things we really have to tackle. You only have to look at what's going on in COP. It's a fucking joke, right? It is so terrible. But as a result, what we're likely to see is we're going to see energy shortfalls, we're going to see higher inflation, and we're going to see much more interventions and subsidies from different governments around the world. We will not be working together. What I'm trying to paint you a picture of is a loss of coordination, cooperation, and cohesion. And the reason I tell you this is because those are the words that create the most amount of fear in the minds of business, right? Because they want to have stability, they want to have predictability. That creates good conditions for business. And so they look at things like supply chain and they talk about friendshoring, they talk about reshoring, all those other buzzwords, right? But really what they're talking about, how can I opt out of this volatility and uncertainty? The answer is you can't. You can hold a little bit more stock for 3 months, but what happens in month 4? The uncertainty hasn't gone away. But that means for New Zealand businesses in particular, it means our cost of doing business is high. Already our insurance premiums have gone up. Our cost of shipping has gone up. We are going to see much more of a challenge around technology. We're going to see a lot more support from governments around the world in terms of technology, but also a lot more holding on to IP and blockades of technology. Why am I talking to you about this stuff? Because if we want climate change mitigation and adaptation to take place, we have to be able to share good technology across borders. If we can't do that, we will not be able to get across that stuff. And yet those are the very things that will be held within governments, within countries, because they will not want to share with those other people who are the enemies. Now, like I said, I'm quite depressing. Even with all this stuff, the world is still getting better. It won't be smooth. I think there'll be a lot of variability. But for me, what it means for New Zealand and for us is there's going to be more demand for things, but more risks, right? We are going to essentially work on this presumption that it's going to be a more spiky world out there. And the words that we really need to get across is how can we be more coordinated and more cohesive? So I want to just show you a couple of pictures because this is stuff that I show quite often to my business clients again to center themselves in New Zealand's strengths and weaknesses, right? New Zealand is a humongous country. Like when you superimpose New Zealand over Western Europe or the UK, you kind of realize just what a huge landmass New Zealand is. We're an enormous country, right? We're an enormous country with very few people on it. But we're also really far from everywhere, right? So 2,000 kilometers around Wellington, lots of nice people in the Pacific Islands, but not a lot of people. 2,000 kilometers around Berlin and pretty much all of Europe, right? And so the reason I'm telling you this is because this relative isolation and relative mass actually is good for New Zealand in the sense that we've got something to offer, but it also gives us an ability to opt out a lot of those cross-border tensions that are affecting these countries. So a lot of the politics of what's going on in Europe right now is refugees coming across borders or across the sea, right? We don't have that problem because we're just so far. The boats can't come this far. They're kind of, Australia's still the last post. But this being far away has cost and benefits. It's that isolation. But how do we not just become isolated? How do we become something that we can offer? Now, the reality is that how New Zealand trades with the world is changing, and that gives us a lot of confidence. And it should give us a little bit of confidence, not because of who we trade with or what we trade with. We're still quite concentrated, but we're getting better. So compared to previous economic shocks, and there have been big shocks around the world through history. Those of you who have studied New Zealand history will know that we've been through these cycles in the past. When the UK joined the EEC, it was almost an existential threat for a lot of New Zealand. But we bounced back. It was really hard, but we bounced back. And essentially, if you look at the composition of New Zealand's trade over time, what you can see is that yes, we are quite concentrated in things like meat, dairy, and forestry today, but also a really big chunk of it is a whole bunch of other things that we do. We've become far more diversified than we've ever been before. If you look at the countries that we trade with, yes, China is our top trading partner, but we also trade a whole bunch with other countries, a whole bunch of other countries. So this diversification is actually really positive in the sense that New Zealand is safer. We're of course still exposed, but we're much safer than we've been before. And when I talk to businesses that are really connected with countries like China, I have to ask them, what would happen if you couldn't trade with China tomorrow? And the answer is pretty obvious, right? That business would close because there is no other customer who would buy that amount of product in short order. But that's okay because it's only one business, it's only one part of the economy. We will be able to get through it. But the challenge for us is, would we be able to look after the people who are affected by those drastic changes? And I'd argue that New Zealand is less prepared to deal with the fallout of these issues than we've ever been before. We were not very good with it when the reforms happened in the 1980s. What happened in terms of the devastation, in terms of particularly farms, for example, when the subsidies were ripped out, it really hollowed out a lot of farming communities. But there was not a lot of support for those farming communities at the time. When we had the massive rise in unemployment through the early 90s, there was no big support for those people who lost their jobs. In fact, we vilified them and we looked down on them. So I do have some concerns that in reality what we'll find is New Zealand is a much harsher place, less kind place when it comes to looking after those people who'll be affected by some of these big shifts that are coming down the pipe at us, because we're still looking at the aggregate and I don't think we care very much for those people at the edges. Now, a little bit of the kind of local priorities, and I show this picture just to shock people because I think there is a shock value to it. Very busy picture, but essentially I've been tracking this stuff for a lot of years. Like, I'm such a nerd, right? I love this stuff. I look at what share of households are buying things like fruit, veggies, meat, pasta, whatever, right? So if I'm going over to talk to guys who are fruit sellers, I can say, did you know 90% of households buy fruit? So people like that stuff, right? But essentially what has happened is in the 80s and 90s and even early 2000s, between 80 and 90% of households would buy fruit in any given week. Last year was 60%. 40% of households in New Zealand did not buy fruit last week. It wasn't just fruit, it was also vegetables, it was also meat, it was also a whole bunch of other things. And essentially what I'm seeing is it's an unprecedented change in the way people consume food, live their lives, because they simply don't have enough income. There is probably a much broader group of New Zealanders who are now poor than we have experienced before. It is shocking stuff, right? New Zealand has no shortage of food, right? We can feed the world in terms of how much food we can produce. And yet in New Zealand, we have a huge amount of hunger, and we have a huge number of New Zealanders who are not eating the kinds of food that would set them up for a good life. So there are some real concerns in terms of that diversity of, I guess, poverty, the concentration of poverty, the breadth of poverty that we're experiencing in New Zealand. The reason I'm telling you this is because sometimes it feels like this stuff happens elsewhere. It doesn't happen elsewhere. It happens here in New Zealand. Quite often we don't see these people because we live in our little lives that are quite protected from a lot of these things, and that's nice for us, but it's not so good for those people, and it's actually really hard for us to find ways to be able to look after their needs. Because what we have seen over the course of the last 30, 40 years in New Zealand is a slow erosion of rights when it comes to people living in poverty, right? And so I worry about this stuff because, when I talk about fracturing of politics, if 40% of New Zealand is poor, who's the middle? Who's the middle, right? These are really hard things. But also we know that New Zealand's issues are not going to be resolved just like that, because what we've got is a growing population, so it doesn't matter whether we have this much immigration or that much immigration. The reality is that New Zealand's population will continue to grow for the foreseeable future. But we're not ready for that, right? We don't have enough infrastructure, we don't have enough houses, we don't have enough ability for us to be able to deal with these kinds of things. People are living longer, but even though we've known this was going to come down the pipe forever, like you don't need an economist to be able to predict that when people live longer, you're going to have more old people around, right? It literally is 1 + 1 = 2. And yet, we've done nothing to prepare for an aging population in this country. Our superannuation is a joke. Our private pension scheme is modest. And our tax system is fundamentally broken. So we've got these issues that are actually really good in that people are living longer, people are going to be around, and they're going to be productive and enjoying life. But we haven't taken the opportunity to make sure that those conditions for them to live a better life exists. I don't know if any of you guys read a book called The Longevity Paradox. Longevity Paradox? Something like that. Essentially, it's a book from the UK, and he goes on about we're living longer, but many people are living their longer lives in worse ways. Poorer health, poorer incomes, and essentially that means that we've got this bigger growing group of people who are dissatisfied because they all thought that they paid taxes all their lives and they prepared and they did their bit to be looked after in their old age. But of course we didn't, right? You all know that New Zealand never ever saved for future generations. Our pension system is pay as you go, not save as you go. All the income that we get as old age pension comes from the taxes of people today, right? Now, I haven't got the chart here today, but essentially in that report that we wrote for Business New Zealand, within the course of the next 20 to 30 years, all of the taxes that we pay on our work, PAYE, will be used up in super and health. All of it. And at what point in time do you think these workers will turn around and go, I don't think so. What about my roads? What about my family? What about my health? What do you mean you're going to take all my money to pay yourselves for something that you never chose to fund? But the reality is we're going to have these conversations, and we still have time. We still have the luxury of time to be able to deal with some of this stuff. So you can see that, essentially we've got some very rapidly growing population of over 65s. The country is going to look very different. The reality is there's going to be a lot more people like me. Right? We're going to have a lot more brown people, we're going to have a lot more yellow people, we're going to have a lot of mixed people. And we're seeing that already, like Auckland's already unusual in how incredibly diverse it is. And that diversity actually has some negatives as well, right? Because now we're starting to come with some cultural differences. And cultural differences are not always good. When you want to travel through some difficult times, when you want to find agreement on certain ways of doing things, that can become harder. When you've got divisions across age, ethnicity, where people live, people's values, people's expectations, what people feel like they have contributed and have not contributed, those differences can become problems, not just good things. Because right now I think, I can't remember where it was, there was one of those ethnic communities conferences, and essentially, if you listen to the ministers, and there's been many, not just this one, they'd come and talk to you about, I love the food and the music and the dance. It's like, oh, fuck off. There's more to life than just food and music and dance, right? I mean, the reality is that, of course, multiculturalism is good and there are lots of positives, but it also comes with risks and negatives, right? And these differences, I think we need to address these things with eyes wide open, because I really worry that we're doing these things as if it's just all going to work out. And it's not obvious to me that it will. But also, I think it's important to understand that we get things wrong all the time, right? So I don't know if you guys know, I'm quite infamous in Wanganui. I called it a zombie town some years ago. And you only do that once, but they had a march in my honor, and they're dressed up as zombies. It coincided with Halloween, but they were like, if you're going to call us zombies, we'll dress up as zombies. It's like, great. But of course, they proved me completely wrong. And so essentially what happened was pretty much for about 20 years until I wrote the book, Wanganui's population had been drifting down for 20 years, right? Nothing was happening. And all the forecasts were, it's just going to go on like this. But of course, as soon as I published the book, they started to grow their population and prove me wrong. And so they're like heaps bigger than they used to be. In fact, they had the first burst of growth in decades. And the reason I tell you this is because it's very easy to kind of sit here and go, these things will cause problems, but they may not. It's all about what happens that we do with it. The other thing that's going on right now, I think, is maybe also an example of where I was really surprised. So 10 years ago, I was doing all these projections for family formations. What will New Zealand's future families will look like, right? And it was really obvious. There'll be lots of singles, lots of couples, because we're getting older, empty nesters, blah, 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 right? Wrote lots of reports, charged lots of money. It was great. What was not on my bingo card was lots of adult children living at home. The fastest growing family group over the last decade in New Zealand is adult children living at home, because our housing market sucks, right? Our children can't leave, so they stay. And so it is what it is, but I think what I'm trying to tell you is that there can be surprises. There's some things that are unpredictable, and those things can surprise us on the good or the bad. But what I try to tell my business clients is these surprises are all about you being ready, about scenario planning and understanding how that might work out. But there are some things that are relatively predictable, like our current tax structure. There was a really great report that came from Treasury a couple of weeks ago. It was all about fiscal incidence. Now, you guys all love reading about fiscal incidence, right? Yeah, I love it. I've got one groupie. But essentially, if you look at the net fiscal transfers, so all the taxes you pay and all the things that are spent on you, essentially, under the age of 15, you're not earning a lot of money, but you're consuming a lot of services, right? Health, education, blah, blah, blah. Between the ages of about 25 to 64, you're paying a lot of tax, right? You're working, you're contributing, but you're generally in good health, you're not consuming that much. So generally speaking, in those ages, there's lots of people who are contributing lots. And then once you're past 65, you're getting super health, all those other supports. And in fact, the fastest growing support for older people right now is the accommodation supplement. Yes. Massively growing because the home ownership rate of older people, retirees, is falling, and so more older people are living in poverty and they qualify for additional forms of support. So yes, we know about health and super, but not on my bingo card 20 years ago was housing assistance being one of the biggest costs of an aging population. But anyway, so that means that essentially when you have lots of people aged between 25 to 64, it's a good thing. When you've got not many of those people, it's not a good thing. And what are we going to run out of? Young people. Right? So on the right-hand side is a picture of the share of New Zealanders who are aged between 15 and 64, and you can see it's going to fall from here on in, with or without immigration, it doesn't really matter. And the reality is that that matters because that fiscal train wreck is coming at us really quick. But it's only just started, right? This is pretty much like the first year that we're going to have more people retiring than people entering the workforce. But it is pretty much the last year, right? From here on in, the calculus will escalate very, very quickly. And we can guess where this is going to go. We can guess the fiscal side, which is obvious. It's more of the politics that's hard to guess, right? How are you going to deal with this uncertainty of this thing that's coming down the pipe? Could immigration be the answer? And the answer is maybe. And we have, in fact, used immigration as a massive source of population growth in the last decade. So again, I don't know if you can see the picture, but can you see that green bar? This one here? That's the inflow of net migration over the course of the last decade. We've never had more people coming into New Zealand through this route ever before. This is extraordinary, right? Already, we're seeing the tension that comes off the back of it. Not enough houses, too much traffic, not enough infrastructure. And it's only going to escalate from here on in, right? If you do that again, if you bring in another 1 million people, what do you think will happen? Do you think the politics will be savory? Maybe not. And we can, I think, make an argument that we need more people, fine. Because New Zealand is a big country. I showed you the map, right? We're a massive country. We could fill it up with another 10 million people and we actually wouldn't notice. I mean, we could ship them off to Invercargill. I mean, they've got so much spare capacity. I love that place. Every time I go to Invercargill, I'm like shocked by the width of the roads, right? It's like, why do you need so much road? Who's driving in this road? The boy racers. Up and down on the little street from 7 p.m. till 10 p.m. And then they go home. It's wonderful. But the reason why I think immigration is a challenge is because while we've had population growth, we've never caught up with the infrastructure, houses, and those kinds of things, right? And on the right-hand side is a bit of a picture, but essentially our experiences, the gray shaded area is how much we've in fact invested in infrastructure, and those dotted lines are what the forecasts were from Treasury. And essentially what you can see, the projections, the forecasts are always optimistic. We're going to do lots of stuff. Yes, yes. I mean, Ian remembers when he was in power, it's like, no, we've got to do that next year. It's got to be done. Just because it's on a piece of paper doesn't mean you can do it, right? And the reality is what happens is that we actually did invest a lot over the course of the last few years, but it takes a long time to wind these things up. It's a big machinery, it's a super tanker, right? But it's a super tanker that has to be turned within 3 years. So what happens? National came out and said, no, we can't do any of those red policies. We're going to do other projects. We're going to do blue projects, right? But going from red to blue, you've got to stop the stuff first. So there's a whole bunch of things to work out. Then you've got to decide what those blue policies are, because they were just dreams when you're in opposition. You've got no resource, right? So you're just making shit up. It's like, oh yeah, we'll have a road. Just draw a big line. Yeah, that looks good. It's true. And then you get into power and go, okay, now can we get the business case to do this thing? And you do. And then you go, okay, now that we've got the business case, can we commission this work? Can we get everything designed and implemented? So quite often it will take 12, 24, 36 months to actually get this thing going. So every time there's a change of government, what we find is the stop-start. And the stop-start is actually really disruptive, really, really disruptive. Because not only does it stop-start the new projects, it also stop-starts the maintenance, which is absolutely shocking. So what we're finding is this politics is getting really deep into the machinations of maintenance and delivery of infrastructure. And so yes, we can have all these conversations about how we want more people to come to New Zealand to do the work or grow the economy or to pay the taxes or to deal with an aging population. But we can't even build the infrastructure for our current population, let alone the growth, right? So I don't know if you guys know, New Zealand has an infrastructure deficit that's in a couple of $100 billion. I made that number up, by the way. Everybody quotes it now. It's great. It's like, oh, I'm sure there was a paper by Treasury or somebody. It's like, yeah, sure. It was Treasury, yeah, good. And the reason why we kind of do this kind of infrastructure deficit stuff is because quite often what it's talking about is the physical stuff people are comfortable talking about, but we're not talking about the social deficits that also exist. So we haven't got the numbers for the latest census yet, but the public health guys from Otago University do the deprivation index for New Zealand by suburb. And essentially, if you look across different parts of New Zealand, it's like comparing Timor with Switzerland, right? The differences in incomes and living conditions are shockingly different. There are parts of New Zealand where people still live in shacks, right? So I was doing some work in Wairoa recently, not recently, 2 or 3 years ago, but just before the cyclone. And we went and interviewed some people who were actually living in tin sheds. In New Zealand, today, we're a rich country. This should not happen. But there's poverty in New Zealand that's actually quite eye-opening and quite distressing. So New Zealand's got these other divisions. It's like, yeah, I'm trying to kind of paint this picture of these uncertainties and these deficits that have accumulated. And it's very easy for us to just go, okay, things are as they are and we're going to build better. But we actually have to deal with some of those underlying issues as well. And it's going to be hard for us to deal with that stuff. It's also true that the experiences of the economy and society and government and all those things are different across different generations. So, if you think about the greatest generation, they inherited, the system as it was, with a huge amount of inequality, poverty, and a whole bunch of problems, and the aftermath of the war. And they pretty much built the welfare state after that. They're like, we can't let this happen again, right? We can't let this happen. And so they put in place a lot of those policies. So, quite rightly, they're known as the greatest generation for the amount of investment that went on, both in the social and physical infrastructure of New Zealand. And as a result, New Zealand's inequality fell, our infrastructure capacity increased. So if you go out to the dam out in Waitakere, you'll see that was built 100 years ago to meet the demand 100 years forward. So when we built the tunnel across Waterview, we built it for the demand as it existed then, right? So that foresightedness is something that's been lost. And then we had the reforms of the 1980s. So, our drunk uncle really kind of did a number on us, right? Because what happened was we had such big economic reforms, we threw out a lot of good stuff with the bad stuff that needed to be thrown out. And we had a big increase in inequality, and the idea was that eventually things will get better and it will take care of itself. But it didn't. In fact, everything that we've seen is inequality has continued to increase over the course of this period. But it shows up in slightly different ways. And one of the ways I think that's important is we've talked about regions, we've talked about some other stuff. The other is generational. It's generational. So if I look at the average lifetime incomes of somebody born in 1985, they, like all the generations before them, would have earned more than their parents. And that's the right thing, right? You want to leave behind, your legacy should be that your children are better off than you. But if you're born after 1985, every generation since then, on average, will earn less than their parents. Doesn't that suck? So why should young people like the things that old people do? Why should young people feel compassion and support for some of those policies that are designed to keep people in the lifestyle they've become accustomed to, or promises they've made to themselves, but have not done enough to change them or to protect them? So this is, to me, again, it doesn't mean that all young people hate old people. That's not true. But it's more that I can see where some of the dissatisfaction comes from, where some of the source of tension comes from. And we're seeing this come up in many parts of the world, and I think New Zealand will not be alone. Housing is another example, of course. This is like my bread and butter. I show this picture all the time. On the left-hand side is a picture of home ownership in New Zealand. So those of you, again, who are interested in history, New Zealand had a package of policies that was all about building and helping people into home ownership from that Second World War era until pretty much about 1970. And it worked, because our home ownership rate rose from around 50% to a peak of about 2/3 of households, right? Just over 70%. But it's been falling since 1991 and is now at the lowest level since the 1950s. So we gave away decades of progress in a very short period of time. So when you've got young people who go, I don't think I'm going to be able to own my own home, or if I do, I'm going to be a slave to my mortgage, well, it comes with a whole bunch of costs, right? It creates division, it creates discontent, it creates less capacity for people to work together. And that's going to be that's the underlying theme of my conversation, is the capacity to cooperate. When you see somebody else as having gotten something that they shouldn't have gotten, or somebody's putting untoward pressure on the system or your society, it becomes hard for you to feel compassion and hard for you to be able to work together on those kinds of things. The other thing that happens, and I get this all the time, my parents tell me this as well, but it was really hard to buy a home in my day too. Come on. So I showed them the picture on the right-hand side to go, no, it wasn't. It was really hard, but it was hard for different reasons. It's way, way, way harder now than it has ever been. Now, these pictures will be really hard to see, but essentially, I also look at things like New Zealand's health by cohort, right? And we had some really good stuff going on. So if you look at diabetes prevalence, heart condition, cardiovascular disease prevalence, they have been getting better for almost every generation that were born after the Second World War, right? And that is as it should be. We are living longer, we have better nutrition, we have better medicine, these are good things. Except for the generation that was born in the 1980s that was going to be worse than their parents' generation. And when it comes to mental health and mood disorders and anxiety, every generation born from the greatest generation onwards has become more anxious and more depressed. So we've got some serious issues also going on in the backdrop that's going to be different in terms of where those risks come from. Again, the reason I tell you this stuff is because if you're physically sick and you're mentally unwell, what capacity do you have to be able to think about other people in that way, to be able to come together to find the consensus, to find that way of working together? Now, I put this chart together for Sam recently. Again, very hard to see, but there are also some new opportunities coming on. While our pension system is still not very good, it's very immature, very modest, I think we could make it a lot better, right? If we did what Australia has done, which is just doing it a bit better over time, it would be enormous, right? And so essentially I worked out the numbers. In 50 years' time, KiwiSaver is going to be $4 trillion, 4.5. That's enormous, right? It's a big chunk of money. But if we made it compulsory and if we increase contributions like Australia has done, it would be $6.6 trillion. Well, we could do with an extra $2 trillion, don't you think? But these are just small policies that you put in place gradually over time that would actually pay really big dividends over time. And so these are potentially new opportunities, because the reason why I like KiwiSaver is because it's outside of the grasp of government in some ways. It's your money, it's in your account, but it's your money that could be put to the use of the country. So it's a different way of essentially paying it forward into your community. So I'm near the end. I just want to talk a little bit about political context, because that's what you guys are really interested in. But is there an antidote to this growing fracturing of society? Because I think that's what I'm trying to paint a picture of, this fracturing of society across these different dimensions. And I think quite often you guys will be looking at things like polling and things like that, and I think they essentially tell you we have tribes, right? Of course we have tribes, and we're tribal in many ways. Although I was really intrigued during the COVID era, the people were like, well, just don't want to die, right? I'll vote this lot in because I just don't want to die. But then that kind of was like, well, it's kind of endemic now, so I can go back to how I was. So it's quite interesting. So polls, I think, tell one story, but polls don't tell you the ideology or the things where the divisions are. Now, this is a really busy picture, and you absolutely will not be able to see it. But essentially, I told you I'm a nerd, right? So I've gone back to every election, go back to the 1980s, and looked at what the parties were campaigning on their big issues. And whether those issues they agreed on. If they're green, they're agreed on. If they're orange, they did not agree on. And so there are some specific things that we have always disagreed on, right? So it's on things like tax, on things like reducing the size of government, on things like asset sales, around things like Treaty of Waitangi. So you can see there are some things that we've got absolute division, right? Very ideologically strong positions of what we agree on and what we don't agree on. But also, if you look at those green bars, there's a whole bunch of things actually our politicians agree on, our politicals do agree on. There's a whole lot of different things that we are actually able to work together on. And this is the challenge that I put forward to business, is how can we find things that are in the interest of business that expands that green zone? Can we get more things that we can talk about that are just right for New Zealand, regardless of whether you're left or right? They're just some things that we want, a minimum viable kind of thing that's going to work. I think one of the problems that I find with my business community is that they think government is all about regulating or taxing. They forget that governments actually do a lot of different things. And essentially the way that I think about government is they influence, they engage, they design, they develop, they resource, they deliver, they control. They do a lot of different things. The focus quite often tends to be on the very right-hand side of that doing bits, the regulating part, that taxing stuff, taking stuff, giving stuff. Now that's obvious, but actually government is a lot more than that. So much of government is actually creating the preconditions for change. And the preconditions part is actually most important. When you see change that sticks, it's only because you've been through a process of conversation and disagreement and eventually coming to a decision of what is the minimum viable set of things that we all agree on. And I'll give you one example. So in Canterbury, after the earthquakes, they actually had did a really good job of the rebuild. It went really quickly relative to international norms. And there's a bunch of reasons for that, but one of the reasons was, for the previous 20 years, the Greater Christchurch Partnership had been hammering out where the future growth would go, where the zoned land would be, where the infrastructure would be, in what sequence that stuff would go out on. And after the earthquake, Jerry Brownlee went and said, this plan is operational. But because the community had been through that nearly 20 years of opposing and going through it, and it had actually been worked out, so then it actually came to something that most people could kind of go, yeah, it's okay, right? I didn't get everything that I wanted, but it's good enough. But that minimum viable set of things was in fact a very powerful reason why Canterbury was able to rebuild after the earthquake as quickly and as seamlessly, relatively speaking, as it could. And it's because this is how government works. It's not always about doing, because that's the visible part, but there is a huge amount of invisible work that goes on behind it that leads up to that point of change. And so if you think about this theory of change, theory of government, I think it's really important for us to think about it from that perspective, because we have to find ways to bring different groups of people together. Now, like I said before, this middle versus many is a problem thing, right? So politics still, and you'll see this in the media all the time, when they talk about politics, it's very much of the median voter. Well, who is the median voter if it's across generations, if it's across ethnicities, if it's across regions? What does it look like? Well, the reason why I think happens is because their training and their understanding of history is we've had two big lots of change in New Zealand, right? Post-war era New Zealand and the reforms of the 1980s. And both of those periods happened because you had one generation that dominated politics. The greatest generation after the Second World War and the boomers during the 1980s. And boomers pretty much were the dominant voter until today, right? If you look at the picture behind me, those are just a share of voters by different generations. And essentially from now on, it's just a big lump, right? It's fractured. There's a whole bunch of equal groups of different generations. But I could slice and dice this in any different ways. But what I'm trying to describe to you is that if you believe my hypothesis that voters and New Zealanders have become fractured across lots of different groups, lots of different identities, lots of different gripes, lots of different hopes, then it's going to be hard for us to find one way of speaking to them that's going to find the answer. Our ability has to be able to go look across the groups and find a minimum viable set of things that people agree is good for New Zealand. They're quite different things. They're quite different things, right? It requires a lot more work, a lot more conversation. And I think it's because our theory of change has to be not just about how do we tinker with what we've got. So there are three ways you can make change. You can tinker with existing ways of doing things, you can introduce new ways of doing things, or you can change the goals of what you do, right? Politically, leadership is about talking about changing the goals of what you're trying to do, the dream, right? What is it that we want to achieve that looks different? What is that mountain that I'm trying to climb? What's that vision that drives us? And that theory of change, I think, makes it really hard. The other thing that I do quite often is take my businesses through this framework, which is about gates and ladders. I don't know if you guys use this, but essentially, if you've got a project or something you want to implement, there are gates, the bad things that you absolutely don't want to do, and ladders, the good things you want to kind of leverage up, right? So I was doing this piece of work down in Taniatua with Tuhoi, and it was all about kind of interpreting tikanga into the economic models. Impossible task. But essentially what we learned is giving me the signal as time out. What he told me was, yes, you've got to know the gates and the ladders, that's important, right? That's obvious. There's some things you don't do and some things you do. But the thing that you've missed is the preconditions of that working. Unity. Coordination and cohesion is what allows you to be able to work together, to be able to stop certain things from happening and sticking behind those good things that do happen. I'm not over time. I don't know why they're getting anxious. So there's a question in my mind around what role will you play? And so I kind of think about it in terms of the Overton window, right? Like, what is the way for us to think about as ideas come through? When does it become acceptable and policy? And the challenge for us is that right now, quite often, and particularly in political parties, we come up with these big ideas, capital gains tax, land value tax. It's going to solve everything. It's everything. But actually, it's quite hard for the rest of New Zealand to grapple with that stuff because it feels quite unthinkable or quite radical. Right? So we haven't taken them with us. It's not within their window of acceptance. They can't grapple with it as something that they can deal with. And that's really challenging, right? It's really challenging because we have to understand the psyche of the people that we're trying to convince. Because we're not trying to do something bad to them. We're trying to work together to create a better outcome for New Zealand. But when we come at people and go, I've got the idea and you don't know, or I've got this excellent plan that you don't understand and you fear, and you're just stupid for not understanding it, it's quite problematic. And there's also the idea of thinking about what kind of agents of change do we see ourselves to be? Are we the rebels? Are we the citizen reformers? Are we the reformers? Are we the change agents? Whatever it is, I think it's important for us to start finding these languages. And I'm sure Ian and others will talk about this stuff with you guys because you have to kind of see yourselves as what role do you play? Like, what's the agent? What kind of agent of change are you? And how will you do that? Now, I want to show you this one last picture because I think this is important. So this was the final outcome of the piece of work that I did with Tuhoi. And we went through lots of geeky stuff. I wrote lots of papers about that stuff, but I had an illustrator with me. And the mountain on the left-hand side is the picture of success for the folk in Wellington. The picture on the right-hand side is the picture of success with the folk in Taniatua. Now, they used exactly the same words. They used, the same aspirational words and visions and things like that. But what you'll notice in those two pictures is that both those mountains are beautiful, but they're not the same. We're actually driving towards completely different ends. Our visions of success, our dreams, our hopes are in fact not the same. If we're not able to find some way to bring those mountains closer together and overlapping, I think we're going to find it really, really hard. And so when I went through this conversation, what I discovered was people were using the same words to describe different things. And as a result, we were talking past each other. So when we had the government officials in the room and we're trying to talk about policy, they were like, why are you saying that? Why is this not getting through? What's going on? And a lot of it, I think, this miscommunication between groups, between fractured groups, is because our pictures of success, those mountains, are actually different mountains. We're driving to different ends, and that is a really big problem. So, is there a way for us to find a non-political pre-politics? And I think that's really the big pitch to business. Politics is volatile, and is there a way for us to find minimum viable bipartisanship? And the answer for business is absolutely. So you would not believe how they lap this stuff up, right? So when we delivered this report to Business New Zealand, we had lots of events, lots of things, but the big thing from business was, yes, we want to deal with the issues of climate change. We need stable policies so we can just get on with it, right? We just want to get on with it. The reality is that we know, even as a political party for you guys, that need out there is absolutely acute. Time is of the essence. New Zealand has some time, but not a lot of time. Those big issues, big forces are coming at us, and it's speeding up. For me, the ideal outcomes for business that I pitch to them is there are three things you're really looking for. You want the policies to be predictable, you want the policies to be proportionate, and you want them to be durable. Once you make a change, they should stick around. But they can only stick around if you can get those governments not to press undo every time they come into government. So what I tell business is that you can focus on what works, but you have to be willing to make the trade-offs. And I think the same applies to you. When you're thinking about your party and about your pitch in terms of how we think about our position, your position out there, you have to think about what is it that's going to work with a large enough group of people that gets you in there. And you have to be willing to make trade-offs. We can't be purists when it comes to what we want to do next. So I'll leave it there. Thank you for having me.
Thanks very much, Shamubeel. So we now have 5 minutes for questions. So if anyone does want to ask a question, please raise your hand. We are recording, so I may run around with our fancy mic here, which may have just stopped recording me. If you don't want to be recorded, just wave me off. I'm not going to be offended. Any questions?
If you could do one big economic policy, if you had control over that, one and nothing else, what would it be?
So I think that's exactly the problem. Yeah? There is no such thing as one big policy that will fix anything. In fact, the entire purpose of policy is that it's evolutionary, right? So this is my problem with public policy. I do quality assurance, a lot of work for public policy stuff. And they go, I want to find that perfect policy solution to this problem. It does not exist. You have to change and morph. And it's the whole point is we got to do good enough. And we have to be willing to grow it and change it over time. So no, there is no one perfect policy that I would ever pitch because it does not exist. There are many ills that face New Zealand and they're completely within our reach. We should be working to deal with all of those things. And they all just require us to be at it all the time. Incremental change is okay, but they need to be change that sticks, and they're the right things. That was very lectury, wasn't it? Sorry. I didn't take it personally. I wasn't attacking you, sir.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the concept of the minimum viable bipartisanship. What are the key issues that you think that we should be looking for that around? Because I think you painted a very vivid picture of how not only politics but society is very fractious, and you get blue and you get red, and then they just do the opposite of that. So where do you think we can find agreement, and what do you think we must find agreement about?
Excellent question. So I encourage you to have a look at that paper that's on the Business New Zealand website. It's called We're in This Together. It's like, I can't believe they paid for it. It's like a communist manifesto published by the Business New Zealand and put on their website. And it's like, this is stuff I've been thinking for years, and I kind of like, nobody's going to pay for this. Like, can you write this? Like, yeah, okay. So anyway, have a read of the paper. And the kinds of things that we kind of put forward to business was around climate change, because I think that's one that's absolutely important, and it is possible because business is totally on board. Immigration, because immigration is something that business use as essentially their kind of buffer for labor markets, right? Immigration and infrastructure. Those were three things that were so visceral, so top of mind. Those were quite obvious. The housing and all, there's a whole bunch of other things, but those were the three things that we thought would be things that business would absolutely resonate with. But the thing is, there's lots of things, right? We need to have, I think we can have a minimum viable non-partisan agreement on housing, because in fact, we're starting to see that. I was talking to Ian about this before. I know it feels like we're not making enough progress within housing, but we've just bottomed in building consensus in New Zealand, and we've bottomed at the peak before the GFC. So our housing market is way more responsive than it has ever been before. Thank you, Phil Twyford, for the work that he did. But he got kicked out because, of course, he also was in charge of KiwiBuild, which is a complete and utter disaster. So we're starting to find some examples of things working together. So I feel a lot of optimism that it's possible. It's when we move from going, the ideological question is when the ideological position is there is a problem or there is not a problem, to going, I want to have a contest of I've got the better solution than you. That's actually quite good, because then you've got some tension in the system. But please have a look at the report. It's not that long. You can flick through the last bit in the conclusion. It's got a bunch of ideas of kinds of issues that I think New Zealand could absolutely find broad agreement on. Sir.
Hi. It obviously may be a bit of a fantasy to have this idea of one policy to unite all these disparate groups. But do you think that there's... we're also long past the days when we had 2 TV channels and 1 newspaper that everybody reads. So I feel like there's an opportunity to find the one issue that each different group cares about and specifically target, those messages to those people. I feel like the technology is here today to actually highly target several different messages to different groups. Do you feel that is the way to go?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer to that because in my gut, I think I want people to be able to care about those other things. Not just about the things they care about now, but to draw them into the wider community. Does that make sense? But that's just my communist kind of side coming out. So
It might be as wishful as thinking there's one common.
This is it. I think we might both be being quite wishful in our thinking. So no, look, I think people do generally kind of engage on other stuff, but you do have to find ways into having those conversations. So I'm sure there's absolute merit in what you're thinking, but I think the comms strategy and the wider engagement strategy needs to be deeper than just a single issue. I think the end goal has to be a single issue to start with, but then using that as a hook to be able to have those broader conversations. Because New Zealand needs to find that agreement across a broad range of things, not just 1 or 2 things. Madam.
You were talking about how, I guess that Auckland, but just New Zealand itself is becoming more and more diversified. There's more migrants coming in.
Yep.
How do we engage migrants in politics or to be engaged in this conversation? I mean, I'm sitting in this room. I'm very well aware that I'm one of the few that's sitting here that looks like me.
Yeah.
So how does TOP or any of the other political parties engage with that migrant population that's completely diversified?
Yeah, I don't have an answer to that. I don't have an answer to that because it's hard, right? Because quite often when you've got new migrants in particular, there are language barriers, but more often than not, they're just getting on with starting a new life. It's a huge task starting a new life in a new place, right? But also I think what I find is the amount of engagement, particularly with second generation migrants, is extraordinary, right? So people care, they love the country, they're a part of New Zealand, all of that kind of stuff, and you become part of that. So I don't know the answer to that, other than I think if you saw my picture of how many new migrants came into the country in the last 10 years, if we don't target these people, and if we don't make them part of the conversation, I think there will be another source of fracturing rather than part of the solution and the way forward. Absolutely right. I just don't know the answer.
Yes, just to comment on the ageing population thing. So my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong here, is so when the retirement age was set at 65, like sometime in the early 20th century, life expectancy was actually like 61, 62.
Yeah, you were not, on average, you're not going to get it.
Yeah. So basically, we're kind of like, we're So, I mean, I think it's kind of inevitable at some point that, we're just going to have to get more realistic about, what old age pensions, can and will be, because, basically, I mean, we obviously it's not affording it, but also, it's an age that was set, for an entirely different time. So, yeah.
Oh, totally. I think the time will come when these things will change. You're absolutely right. I think it's just that it's so bloody good right now. People don't want it to go.
Really interesting presentation. I just have a question for you about role models. As a minority party, who do you think we should model ourselves on in the context from an economic point of view, the minority parties that we've seen so far?
I don't know the answer. I think you should ask the panel that's going to come afterwards. This is well beyond my pay grade.
Excuse me. Do you have a feel or a rule of thumb on what tax rate progressive liberal democracies should have? Ronald Reagan pulled it out of his arse and said 30% of GDP should be the limit. When questioned on it, he said he got that information from eminent economists.
But couldn't find them afterwards. Yeah.
When he was asked which economist, he couldn't tell.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm thinking of the Scandinavian countries. Like, it seems that 30% of GDP, the country's always going to be poor. So do you have feedback on that, please?
Yeah. So the way you think about tax rate is not, you don't start from how much tax do we collect. You start from what do we want the state to provide. That's the starting question. And then you go, and then how do we tax it and who pays for it and all that kind of stuff. And so I think New Zealand's never been able to have the conversation because whenever a political party comes along and goes, I'll give you a tax cut, we choose that party. So we're voting in a way that says we would rather have low taxes and would rather have lower service levels and provisioning, except when it breaks. Why is health so bad? Not because of my taxes, it's for some other reason. It's incompetence. It's the bad nurses and the bad doctors or the bad managers or the head office, right? So it's everybody else's fault but ours. So the sad reality is New Zealanders are complicit in this. We want to have low taxes, we want to have low debt, and we want to have fabulous public services. So we're not actually, like you say, if we wanted Scandi-level services, we should have Scandi-level taxes. If you want to not have these kinds of services, then New Zealand actually does really well for how much tax we pay. The quality of our infrastructure is still relatively good despite the deficits. Quality of our health system is actually still very good despite the weaknesses. I mean, I went there for a personal reason recently with my elderly parent, and the level of care is extraordinary. And not just the technical care, but just the care from the people. You know, New Zealand still has that magic. It's pretty cool. But it's not going to be there forever because at the moment we rely on these people to essentially give us their labor for love. Love doesn't go that far. I'm quite infamous as once saying tax is love, and the New Zealand initiative came out and said, no, tax is rapacious. Those people are so gross.
All right, I've lined up 3 more questions.
Oh my goodness.
We'll try and keep them reasonably quick.
Do you want me to stand up?
Yeah.
That was a dig at me, right? Because I can't do short answers.
So you talked about finding common ground, which I think is really important, but how do we make that common ground more important when sowing discord is so much more efficient in our current climate?
Totally. I mean, look, I don't have the answer, and that's why I go to business, because when you go to business, they're on LinkedIn. They're not on Twitter, right? So it's actually much easier because they're too busy to do all their divisive stuff. So they talk to a very homogeneous group of people, so it's actually relatively easy for us to have these conversations and move from denial to, we can go through that Overton window really quickly. And so I think therein lies the challenge, is finding ways where there's decisions being made, where you can move through that change relatively quickly, because people are thinking about it with perhaps very good financial reasons or whatever the very selfish reasons there might be, but whatever it is, there is a reason why they want to engage in the conversation. But if it's just talking for the sake of talking, I think I would agree with you that it's much easier to sow discord than it is to bring unity.
Hi, I'm going to be cheeky. So just in regards to the whole idea about the treaty and how we become a partnership, have you had any, like you were talking about one of the iwi that you were with, but the idea of having a different economy for Māori as well as, and then for our treaty partners. Have you had any thoughts about whether or not Māori would be better to have their own economy inside New Zealand? Sorry, close to cheeky.
Yeah, look, let me answer it in this way. There is no such thing as the economy. It just doesn't exist. In my mind, the economy is relationships between people. So if iwi Māori want to have a separate economy, then they have to be separate people entirely, right? No relationships. I just don't think that's reasonable because that's not the foundation of Te Tiriti. It doesn't mean that we exclude ourselves and nobody is welcome and we will have no relationships. In fact, it's entirely relational. So in my mind, it's kind of that's a very challenging kind of concept in my mind because it kind of defeats the purpose of what an economy is. So don't get dragged into the trap of the usual kind of talk about the economy is the GDP or whatever. That's just what we measure. I mean, what you count is not what matters, right? Then you'll be like an accountant, right? But the reality is that, for me at least, when it comes to the conversations that I have with people who've been thinking about this stuff, and I'm certainly not a scholar in this space at all, but the people I have talked to about, their view is that we've got a vision that's 1,000 years, 100 years out. We're just going to keep doing that stuff because we build it on the basis of consensus and shared agreements, right? And this stuff will happen and we have to just figure out how to deal with it. Nobody that I speak to says, we're going to do it in spite of or without these people who are in the wider New Zealand. Does that make sense?
So you're talking about people like Māori, like Iwi, so they see it like 1,000 years.
Yeah. We don't. Our orthodoxy does not have a 1,000-year view. We barely have a 3-year view.
All right, last question.
So my question is about climate change. So this coalition government is like reversing lots of climate policy for our country. Like if you look at the fast track bill has passed its second reading, and they're reversing the offshore oil and oil and gas exploration. So what do you think are the challenges for us to adopt more climate policy and transform our economy and use more renewable energy? Because if you look at the UK government, they already include their maritime sector in the ETS, while our agricultural sector is still not in the ETS. Yep. So so that's my question.
Look, it's a really good question, and you're absolutely right. But again, I'd answer it in this way. The path towards decarbonization is not going to be linear. It's going to be jagged, and we're going to find lots of slips along the way. Unfortunate, because we need to go fast and we need to be consistent, but we're not. But the reality is that when there's a change of government, I'm absolutely confident a whole bunch of this stuff will get undone, and they're going to put in even stronger policies to try and push it forward more quickly. And then there'll be a change of government and they'll try to undo it. But progressively, there'll be things that will stick and they'll become normal. And this is why it's so important to have business behind you to create, or whoever, to create the broad base of things that are this is just a no-brainer. We should just do it, right? So when you come into power next time, National, don't undo those ones because we like those ones. Just do those other things that we don't like. Do you know what I mean? So to my mind, policy progress is evolutionary, but evolutionary is not linear. It's not a straight line, right? And that's why I was saying when I was talking about fossil fuel transition, I was saying that it's going to be an uneven path. And I think that's exactly what's going to happen with New Zealand's climate change journey as well. It's going to be very uneven. I think what you're going to find is there's going to be a lot of focus on adaptation in New Zealand for the next little while because we're going to have the floods and the fires and the storms. All that stuff is just going to happen. So the insurance guys are already going, well, we just paid you 1% of GDP last year. We don't want to do that again, right? They normally pay out 0.1% of GDP. And when it's 10 times that, it's like, well, no, we don't like New Zealand so much. You got to pay higher premiums. I don't know if any of you have insurance. Have you seen how much your premiums have gone up in the last 12 months? Boy, it hurts, right? So they skin you along the way. So there's going to be a lot of pressures that will sometimes be outside of politics that will force change. So don't lose hope because I think sometimes it feels like it's very dystopian. But particularly around climate change, I think as long as you understand that policy progress is going to be uneven, it's going to be ideological. But along the way, we need to fight out bigger ground to hold on to. I think that's going to be the way we're going to make progress. It's not going to be pretty.
I mean, I think we can call that a semi-positive note. So we'll hold on questions for now. We're going to take a very short break.